Welcome to The Breakdown with Brodkorb and Becky, a weekly podcast that breaks down politics, policy, and current affairs. I'm Becky Scherr.
And I'm Michael Brodkorb.
We are bringing you a bonus episode today with a return guest, David FitzSimmons. David is a great friend, one of the smartest political minds in Minnesota and the country, I would say, and longtime chief of staff on the Hill. Michael and I have both worked with David over the years, and he gave me my first shot with a role in the Tom Emmer's gubernatorial campaign back in 2010. He has served in the Minnesota House of Representatives, then went on to serve as chief of staff for Congressman Tom Emmer, campaign manager for Congressman Jim Hagedorn, then chief of staff for Congresswoman Michelle Fischbach, and currently leads the office for Congressman Brad Finstad. And he is an endorsement expert, and that is what we are really here to discuss today. We're going to start by breaking down the state of the GOP here in Minnesota, especially as it relates to Trump's recent visit to the state, the recent MNGOP convention and its outcomes and participation, and all of it centers around the breakdown of what this all means for the endorsement process for Republicans in Minnesota. Thanks for joining us and enjoy the show. We are joined today by one of my favorite people ever, David FitzSimmons. David, we want to start by talking about Trump's recent visit to Minnesota. You were at the Lincoln Reagan dinner. Can you talk to us a little bit about the vibe in the room, how he was received, how his speech went down, and just the overall event?
Yeah, it was a great visit by President Trump to the MNGOP and in Minnesota. He's talked about putting Minnesota on the map and expanding the map. That's been a lot of the chatter out there. I think we've seen two or three polls in a row that have again shown President Trump within 2 points of President Biden. I think that's a real proof that there's something there, and definitely in the room, you could feel it. This was a plated dinner, so there's only so many places. It's a fundraiser, so people are paying to be there, and it was a packed house. There were over 1,500 people. It was sold out in really pretty short notice as well of the president being there and them throwing it together. He was in great form, very lively. I've seen him enough now to see some of the different styles that he can bring, and he was really in his comedian role. He was really funny and really had the crowd going and reacting very positively. Many ovations for him. So it was a great event, and they were, able to announce it as a, big financial success to the party as well.
David, one of the points, and I've said this on the show, I didn't vote for Trump in 16 or 20. And one of the things that was really interesting to me, and Becky and I discussed this on last week's episode with John Rouleau and Kip Christensen about Trump's visit, that it was very much a team atmosphere. Because one of my kind of criticisms of Trump has been that if he's a nominee, it's not going to be much of a team effort. And I think that argument that I've made was blown away last week because he came and it was a very much a team atmosphere. I keep hearing from people that were at the event that it was a different kind of event that Minnesota Republicans have seen in a long time, which is largely attended, big fundraiser for the party, which was great, and a very much a collaborative team effort. And I think that's a fresh change and what I think is needed for Republicans to be competitive in this state. Is that fair?
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. He was very complimentary of David Hand, the chair of the party, very complimentary of the party at large, complimentary of Whip Emmer and our congressional delegation, Fischbach, Sauber, and Finstad, and encouraging people to support them. There was Governor Burgum was there as well, and really got in on that vibe. Also talking about working together, and I do think from President Trump having been in there for the 4 years that he was. I was out here during that time, and he definitely had very different experiences. And I think he's very appreciative, I believe, of what having a Congress that he can work with looks like and what that can do versus what the alternative is. And so I think he very much wants to get back in the White House, but I think he definitely wants a Congress that he can get things done with. That was in his first 2 years, the first half of his first term. He had a Republican Congress, and they were able to get through tax cuts and jobs in many of the CRAs and the deregulation and get Keystone Pipeline rolling and make that progress. And in the second half, he didn't have that anymore and really had to play a much more fighting for every inch kind of game. So I think I believe he's very aware of that, and he's shown that in his endorsements, really trying to bring productive members and good team members back to Congress to work with them.
What does it mean for the party's operations to have that type of event? How does both of you have worked more recently than I have in kind of party operations and how things happen? What does it mean to have that type of big event fill the party's coffers operationally? How much is that a benefit coming into this election cycle?
Yeah, it's critical and crucial. Even with really good grassroots support and volunteer efforts and all of those things, which are obviously helpful and can be leveraged, you really still need an organizational side that comes with having staff and having people that are day in and day out managing people, managing resources, targeting, being strategic and tactical with where they're going. That it's huge.
I just did a little quick math here. So we talked last week about how tickets were ranging from 500 to $100,000, the different tiers and everything of that sort. So if we look at this with 1,500 people in the room, and party effectively brought in probably close to $750,000 or upwards, and those are resources, those are dollars, those are mailers, phone calls, text messages, those are events they're able to hold, those are staff they're able to hire. That is just huge going into end of May here, beginning of June. We're having filing deadline just around the corner. And so being able to really focus on taking back that House and of course up ballot benefits the congressional and presidential as well. I think it's really incredible. One thing that David, I did want to ask you about this attitude change, maybe the teamwork and Trump's way of looking at it. Do you think that, and I know you don't have the inner workings of President Trump's mind, wouldn't that be a thing to have? But do you think this was a conscious effort and decision by his team to have a little bit different way of communicating and acting through this campaign cycle?
Yeah, I think they're definitely operating in a very collaborative and team manner. And again, I think they have before, but I think having that experience of seeing the different ways he has a Congress that he can work with and a
Mhm.
Congress that he doesn't really pulls that into full contrast of what he wants to have in his second term. So I think they're doing a great job at working with people and making sure they have the right people going back to Congress.
That's great.
David, how does Minnesota has been a real puzzle for Republicans to win on the presidential race? What is the Trump campaign, closing out this part of the show, this subject, what does the Trump campaign need to do to be competitive in Minnesota?
Yeah, I think they obviously the resources we covered that piece, and the attention. It's going to need to be to stay top of mind and stay part of the overall plan. I think one of the good things about Minnesota and in that regard, and from the presidential map, is it weaves in pretty nicely with Wisconsin. I know we don't necessarily think that from a sports perspective, but
God, no.
from a media market perspective and shared logistics and things of that nature, I think it really, can play together well with that. And so I think if they really get in on the early side and marry those things up, again, the crossover with Minneapolis TV, with Duluth TV, with Lacrosse TV, you're hitting all that from a media side. So I think staying on the air in Minnesota is going to be a big part of what needs to happen. I think having that real engagement at the congressional level is also a big thing. It was only in 2020 was the first time post 2020, the first time since a brief stint when Chip Kravac was in Congress and after the 10 election until the 12 election. But that's largely the only time we're in the only time in the last 20 years, other than that where we've had 4 and 4 on the congressional level.
Mhm.
We've generally played at a disadvantage of a 5-3. And so I think and especially that maturing of those operations, I think that can really play in and maximize those vote totals. We did a lot in the Fishbach campaign last cycle to drive up her vote totals, which wasn't just for the bragging rights of winning by 40 points. It was to drive up the Republican vote totals in the district. And we were able to improve the gubernatorial from 18 to 22 by 7% in her district. I
Whoa.
think that's Yeah, and so I think repeating that, doing the work that we had obviously set up in Congressional 6 with Congressman Emmer, and they're doing a great job there. And then in 8 and 1, I really think that's a big part of it as well, that we can turn that tide.
David, you may not know that Becky is raised as is a Packers family, so she's probably very happy with the fact that Wisconsin's getting this attention.
Making the
I,
peace.
I'm just pure Minnesotan and Viking, so I think it makes sense for her. I'm sure she's going to be very supportive of that kind of connection between Minnesota and Green Bay, which is disappointing.
Love it.
And obviously that plays off the Milwaukee National Convention as well, being right next door. And hopefully that also is a boost just in general to the upper Midwest here of our attention, the attention being here from the Trump campaign and the RNC.
Absolutely. We had a great so the Republican Party had, as you would say, great Friday night, and then we go into Saturday. Let's talk about the events at the state convention and the endorsement process. Let's lump these sections in together. David, you and I had exchanged some messages offline and going through some stats. Give your kind of rundown of the events at the state convention, and also dip into some of that analysis on the attendance and what's going on now with the endorsements and the convention that occurred on Saturday.
I think we're seeing some definitive trend lines of participation rates in the party process. And I think we have to figure out how to have some real honest conversations about those things. Um, we never really saw reported attendance from precinct caucus. At least I've not seen any. But by my estimations on the Republican side, we're maybe in the 12,000 statewide range, which is well below really any historical averages in the last few decades. So I really relatively low. They're harder to track now that the presidential straw poll is not in there. So we don't get that kind of snapshot and that help with our math and that reporting. And I think that, of course, makes a difference. But I think that's a reality then that we have to readdress of where we're at. Because, again, seeing when you look at 12,000 people participating at the end of February on Republicans, and then 1 week later having 340,000 Republicans vote in a presidential primary, that's a big gulf of participation. And if people are not wanting to participate, then what is the solution to that? Because I think the endorsement system is set up to be a representative way of doing things. But if the pool just continues to be so self selecting, then you really aren't representing because for the most part, then people are going to precinct caucuses. They call it being elected from precinct caucuses, but in nearly all cases, everybody that attends a precinct caucus and wants to be a precinct delegate is a precinct delegate. And then they're going to their local convention, their BPOU, so their Senate district or county convention. And again, then they're asking to be elected to state and congressional district conventions. But really, what we saw more pronounced in this cycle than ever before is very few elections for those. It was really just whoever said, I will do it. And in some cases, near arguments over who should do it because there weren't enough volunteers. And I think then that's ultimately, was borne out with what we saw at state convention, which is something I've never seen in my time before. And my guess is, Michael and Becky, the same with you, where we really barely had 60% of delegation. And it's really worse than that because if you take all the delegates and alternates who were elected at their local conventions, that would have been almost 3,600 people that were eligible to be at that convention and be seated. And our top voting strength after seating all alternates was 1,375 delegates and seated alternates. So that's about 38% of the eligible people who could have been there were there and voting. And I think that's a real conversation we have to have as Republicans is what do we do with that? Because that's really then a shrinking pool just in size and coming from already shrinking pool. And so you're representing even fewer people. And then you really just then come to I think some difficult truths. We saw multiple counties in greater Minnesota that didn't have a single person there. And then one that was seated right by mine was Lyon County. City of Marshall, the former headquarters founding of Schwann's ice cream, minority leader and gubernatorial candidate Marty Seifert from there for and represented that for years, and over 25,000 people and not one single delegate or alternate, not a ballot cast in any function that we did as a party. And so it's hard then to say, given all of that, that then that convention can speak in a representative voice when the participation levels were so low. So I think that's a real problem in a disconnect between the wider Republican world and what's going on at precinct caucus and convention.
We've talked about this a lot. I love and hate the endorsement process, right? I learned from you back in 2010 at the Emmer gubernatorial battle with Marty Seifert from Marshall, Minnesota back then. It is a chess game that can be won and lost. There are benefits to it. But as you say, it is really something, and especially something that I recognize a lot more now as, being married, owning a house, having a child, that life obligations really are a lot. So to go to caucus in February and then your BPOU convention in March or April, and then take a whole weekend where you often have to stay overnight and spend hundreds of dollars to go sit in a room for long days at times. We've seen them go 12, 15-hour days. It's a lot to ask of people. And so you already, like you mentioned, already are pulling from a pool of people who have means, have time, have accessibility, have help, and the support to be able to do that. And it is just, when you were sharing those numbers, that is mind boggling to me. I come from the same as history that you were talking to of 2010 and 2014, where you have 600 alternates waiting up there for their opportunity to get down on the floor and be part of the voting delegation. And so not only that there was almost 40% of that delegation filled is just really astounding. And we've talked a lot about how there's always a conversation about moving away from the endorsement and moving to a primary. And we've seen some candidates over the years going to the primary, whether that's Tim Pawlenty or others, going to that primary to attempt to buck the endorsement process. And to date, it hasn't been super successful. I think this might be the year where some of the endorsed candidates do get picked off in the primary. But as you said, we really need to, if this is supposed to be a representation of the Republican Party across Minnesota, we're clearly not there and missing the mark. So either something significant needs to happen to fix that. And I don't know what that is. I don't think there is one single thing that can draw those people back in to get more than 12,000 people attending precinct caucus in February. But it does seem the gig might beat up on this, right?
Yeah, I think again, I think it's at least illustrative of an issue that I think we need to talk about. And I do think, yeah, primaries generally haven't been successful in Minnesota, but I think a lot of times that's where I think there's still a connection between you have enough people involved in the process where you are getting a sample size. You think of a poll,
Right.
right? There's a process you can do a scientific poll to actually get a representative number to be able to talk to 400 people and still know what a state is
Mhm.
thinking. So there is a way to have a selection process, but when that becomes so, again, the pool becomes so shallow that there's not enough pieces to pick out of, then you start getting what's regarded as junk polls, where, the poll is not done scientifically. And then so you're getting a result that's out of whack. And if that's the case, then a primary is always going to be a check on if that was actually where people were at. And so we have seen those. Jim Hagedorn won against an endorsed candidate back in 2014. Obviously, Governor Carlson did, and those are at higher levels. It's happened more numerous times at House and Senate campaigns at the local level. I think that argument of where endorsement and primary should begin and end is going to take place yet for a while. But I think at the end of the day, you can't go so far out of the will of the majority of people
Mhm.
and make it work. And so if the will of the majority of Republicans is too out of alignment with the numbers that have self-selected at an endorsement process, then that's not ultimately a recipe for success.
No, and I agree with both of the points you made. I think all of us fairly would say that I think our positions on the endorsement have evolved. When I served in party leadership, was party staff, and we supported the endorsement process. The endorsement simply isn't working. I think there's far too much emphasis on this non-binding intramural contest, and it has become a distraction from campaigns, focusing on the broader electorate, focusing on primaries, focusing on the general elections, and it has just become. It's become, in essence, it's like winning a preseason game in the NFL. It's just meaningless, but we seem to be celebrating it, and we want to have parades for a team winning a preseason game. I think it's just a huge mistake. And I think it's this weekend. I think the endorsement was on life support. The process was, particularly as we've seen some of the congressional endorsements. And I want to be clear and just say that I think that the fact that Congresswoman Fishbach was not endorsed, that's a problem for me, in a sense that to think that she's not the type of Republican who can get endorsed, that boggles the mind.
Absolutely.
That boggles the mind to me. And then to have what's going on in other parts of the state with these endorsements, and then come into the state convention and see who does get endorsed and the low percentages. The bottom line is, if someone can show to me how the endorsement process is helping candidates win elections, then I would be more of an advocate for it, but it's not. The last time the Republican endorsed candidate for governor got more than 50% of the vote was 1978. Al Quie was the last Republican endorsed candidate to get more than 50% of the vote. The last time a U.S. Senate candidate in Minnesota got over 50% of the vote was Dave Durenberger in 88. Arnie Carlson won in 90 and 94. He was not endorsed either time by the Republican Party. And so that doesn't count. So Republicans have last won statewide in 2006, but that was a very close election for Governor Pawlenty. And so the party's endorsement process has far too much emphasis, and it has become a distraction, just like an intramural game. It's an intramural contest, just like a preseason game, but it's gotten far too much significance. And I think the fact that we're sitting here today, and David, your analysis on the numbers really show how much it's on life support, and really how much it's not working. When you get to the fact that 1,375 people, which is only 38% of the larger pool, showed up. But of that 1,375, 67% made an endorsement for U.S. Senate. And that's not a reflection of where the entire broad party is. And what you said about Lyon County, I used to be the 2nd District field rep for the party in 1998. Lyon County was part of the Republican L. It's the heart and soul, used to be some of the Gold Coast for Republicans to win, and to not have them have any representation at the state convention is just astounding to me.
Yeah, I think there's, again, some reflection that needs to take place. And I do think that's part of, we have to have some of these things out there to be able to talk about them. And I think that's where I get a little frustrated, because people don't know how many people were at precinct caucus, right? Generally, Republicans have no ability to have, your average Republican has no ability to access that information. So they simply have no clue what the participation rate is. And so I think getting that out there, and again, we also never had that, such a close comparative A/B test before, right? And now, with the presidential primary being 1 week from precinct caucus, we can see side by side the difference.
Mhm.
And what was very clear and undeniable is 30 times as many people decided to participate in, and let's be honest, a largely foregone conclusion presidential primary election just 1 week after precinct caucus. And for every one person that went to precinct caucus, they and 29 other people went and voted in that presidential primary. So I think you do have to realize that there's a wide gulf there. And what does that mean? And I think, if people from the endorsement process side, if you want to set yourself up as being a representative form of government, right? Like, you're going to be representative of your area, then you have to see it as that. And so, when is the last time people that were any process of the delegate posted on their Facebook page and said, "I'm a delegate. What do you think? What do you think I should do?" When people are elected officials, they all of that is public information. They can be accessed. They have to get the public feedback. So I think there's a disconnect between people wanting to say they want the power side without the responsibility side,
Yep.
and the power to speak for people without actually making themselves accessible to those people to get their opinions and figure out where they're at.
David, where does the party go from here?
I think one thing is really the party needs to, and I think that it seems obvious to say maybe, but I've seen it become very not obvious, as the party's really mission is to elect Republicans. And I that's really the core mission, the prime directive of the party, and that needs to be the focus of people who are involved in the party. And I think it's really got sidetracked from that. And I think when you lose your core mission, when you lose your prime directive, you really can begin to wander off in a lot of different directions. And again, I think that's not to say people as individuals shouldn't do whatever contact methods they want of elected officials and weighing in with them and expressing themselves. But the party as a structure really was meant to win in general elections. That's what it's supposed to be do, and that's what it's supposed to be set up to do. And I think the party needs to get back to that.
David, you're right. We appreciate you being here today and giving your perspective. And we hope to have you back as we continue to do analysis. Your wisdom is second to none, and your analysis and your commentary and your understanding of the party apparatus is just remarkable. And so we thank you so much for being with us today. Okay.
Thank you, guys.
Thank you.
Becky, we just interviewed one of the smartest Republican strategists in this state, David FitzSimmons, to talk about a little bit of a breakdown on the numbers of the convention. He had some great analysis on the attendance and other kind of process, and really put, I think, in numbers terms, why the endorsement process is dying. Your take?
Yeah, like I said, David, like you just put it, David is one of the truly smartest political minds in the state and beyond, and has played a significant role in numerous endorsement wins, has been a huge role. He's chaired the convention, he's been in the party, he's really done everything at all levels, and to always has great analysis. And one that I hadn't heard before, and I guess not maybe too surprising, is blown away by the numbers of folks that showed up and participated in the convention this last weekend. And it really is a little sad. Like I said, I came up in this process. These conventions were the thing. They were big. They were huge parties and ways to celebrate and really come together and get party business done, get these endorsements done, but also work together and have conversations and really try to move our party forward together. And so the fact that 1,400 people were, when it was at its top voting strength, is just wild to me and really disappointing. But I think, as David laid out and as we discussed, is really what needs to be looked at when we talk about the future of the endorsement, because we've had this history of Republicans continuing to lose in on election day, and that is a problem in itself. But when we've seen these kind of different groups and organizations and wings and factions of the party kind of take over this process, it's not working. It's no longer representative of who Republicans are and what we stand for in this state. I didn't go to caucus this year. This is, I think, one of the first 21 or yeah, the last couple years have been the first time that I haven't been active in that. And it's because I don't feel that's my place to be anymore. But this is where we elect our candidates that stand for our party on the ballot. And as we know, that came out of this last convention, it really blew up in our face. And I think it's going to be something that Republicans in Minnesota are going to have to wear, hopefully only till primary, but unfortunately, likely through election day in November.
Let's use that as a transition point to our next subject, which is the endorsement process and the endorsement of Royce White. Would you like to start, or should I begin?
I'll just start by saying we last week briefly mentioned the upcoming convention. I said I didn't really know much about even who was running in general, but I think Joe Frazier is one that businessman, somebody that we thought had a good shot, is a good candidate of moving forward. It's Amy Klobuchar. I'm not under any illusion that any Republican was going to take down Amy Klobuchar, regardless of who got endorsed. But when I saw what came out and it was an overwhelming endorsement of Royce White. We can say that. What I then started to look into a little bit more of who he is and how he conducts himself. And wowzer, it's sad, it's alarming, it's disturbing, and really unfortunate that, again, this is somebody who Republicans up and down the ballot right now are tied to, unfortunately, in the state of Minnesota. But I want to give you the opportunity here because it's been really it's been tough to watch the what you've been enduring on Twitter since the endorsement. And I always said all along, I don't want to work for a candidate who is a Twitter warrior. It's not a good place for a candidate in any capacity, but especially one who conducts himself in such a gross, inhumane way that has been coming out over the last couple of days. So I would like you to share a little bit of your interactions and what you are seeing, and we can get into some of the disturbing history. Royce White here.
It was surprising. I think there was a number of people that were surprised by the process. Again, one of the things that I want to note is for the last 10 years, and you talked a little bit about your history. 2014, there was a convention. And what happened around 10 years ago was something I think changed a bit when the endorsement process. And it used to be that the endorsement process was, and the endorsement and the state convention was the culmination of campaigns racing around the state, doing good work, and then after the activists have kicked the tires on these candidates, they come into the state convention, they give a speech, and there's a victor. That's at least it was for me. Something changed in 2014, and you were at that convention where Philip Parrish came in out of the blue and gave some crazy speech, and he was a real player at that convention. We saw that at the state convention in 2022, where Mike Murphy, who had no money, comes in and he's able to upend that convention. And what's happened is that the activists inside the party, the delegates and alternates who have a responsibility and who like to present themselves as being good stewards of the party brand and that they're going to do their homework. What this is happening is that they're just endorsing the person who gives the best speech the day of the convention. There's no discussion and analysis about what the status of the campaign is. How can they win? Are they going to win? Are they in a position to win? It is an absolute advocation of their responsibility as Republicans to vet and examine these candidates. And we need to dispel the myth that these are thoughtful decisions made by thoughtful people that are really getting their pen and pencil out and they're really checking off and really examining these candidates. The endorsement of Royce White, I think, is going to be the death knell of the Republican Party endorsement process. I think it's an absolute failure. Let's talk about the numbers again. There were 1,375 people at the top number. Royce White got roughly 67% of that number. And that's who bestowed this endorsement. There were empty seats in the convention hall. Royce White was able to get 67%, and he was able to get endorsed. Anyone who voted for Royce White, anyone who facilitated Royce White getting endorsed, is really not very smart. And I'm really challenged by the mindset of people that helped facilitate the endorsement, voted for him, and do it. First of all, let me say, the job of the party, and I'm someone who's been very critical of the party in the past, the job of the party in this situation is to be like the NFL. Their job is to run the venues, make sure there's referees, and that the process is fair. The party leadership doesn't vote in these endorsements. It's the activists in the crowd, the attendees of the delegates that there. It's the party's job to make sure the venue's there and the lights are on and the microphones are paid for and all that type of stuff. And so this isn't a party leadership problem. This is an activist problem. And this is an activist inside the party. And anyone, again, who helped facilitate that endorsement, who helped speed it up, who voted for him to get endorsed, boy, oh boy, you should be looking at the mirror because there's no credible way that anyone can say that Royce White is a credible, responsible candidate for the United States Senate. After Royce White got endorsed, I reached out to a couple of people that I knew were somewhat connected to the campaign just to get a sense as to what their thought process was. And basically it was this: Republicans weren't going to win the U.S. Senate race. So why not just throw a curveball into the election? And what's the worst that Royce White can do? There was no vetting of him, any substantive vetting of him. And Royce White has past statements that I think are problematic. He has current legal issues that are problematic. And I also do not believe that he has the temperament and the judgment, and he has the ability to is going to fare well under the scrutiny of a statewide election. And let's just look just briefly, since all politics is local, I'm going to make this just very briefly about me for a second. Within 6 hours of this guy getting endorsed, called me a moron, called me a dumbass, called me a punk, challenged me to a debate, and told me to shut my mouth. Now, for our listeners, I'm not running for the United States Senate. I'm not, and so if you, and just a little free kind of political 101 tip. When you run for office, the person you should challenge to a debate is your opponent, not some dad who's at a softball or a baseball tournament just watching things that's happening. Royce White came out swinging. And I understand in the Action for Liberty kind of red meat crowd, this MAGA crowd, that's a great thing. He acted like a complete and utter jackass on social media. And successful politics is about addition and multiplication. It's not about subtraction and division. And there's not one thing that Royce White has done to show that he's in any type of credible position to win the nomination and win the race. Not only do I not think that he's in a credible position to win, or is he a credible candidate, I think he's a chaotic, combustible candidate. And I get the people that want to blow up the system and shake things up and do this type of stuff. This is like traveling with dynamite in the back car. And what the Republican activists just did is they threw a couple sticks of dynamite in the back seat of the car, and now the Republican car is driving around the state with Royce White in the back seat. And it's just a mess. His social media presence is obnoxious. And let me just say to you, I would be very hard pressed for anyone who knows my history to think that I've ever been afraid of throwing a punch in politics nor receiving a punch.
Mhm.
I got thick skin. I'm a big boy. I can handle it. But the level of just crude commentary that Royce White engages in. My policy on social media has always been, I'm never going to say something to someone on social media that I wouldn't say to their face. And over the years, as I've gotten a little older and a little bit more sentimental and a little, not necessarily softer, my rhetoric has certainly changed in terms of my level of partisanship, but I'm not afraid to mix it up. This guy is a foul-mouthed jerk, and he is just an absolute jerk. And to think that that's going to be a successful way is to make anti-Semitic statements, is to demagogue any particular person that you can. That's not a way to win. If we have to win by being anti-Semitic, if we have to win by being hateful towards every conceivable community that you can, that's not a way to win. And I absolutely do not believe that the wing of the party that endorsed Royce White on Saturday, the Alex Jones, Steve Bannon wing of the party, is the recipe that's needed for Republicans to win. Anyone who voted to endorse Royce White, any person who helped facilitate his name being placed in nomination or to speed up the process for him to get endorsed should absolutely be ashamed of themselves.
Yeah, like I said, I was seeing some of the interactions, so I did a little bit more digging, and I want to start by saying, in my career, and I've had some opportunities to be involved with hiring and communicating with staff and managing staff and things of that sort. And there, we'd always have a conversation of, is there anything in your past on social media that would be an issue if it came out? There be anything that would be a story if it came out? Wow. Here, that, and I'm talking like a press secretary or like a field rep, lower level staff that play an integral role. But I've also told them, if I have to spend ever 2 minutes on defending something that you've tweeted or said to the press, we're going to have an issue. Now we have a candidate who is a statewide candidate representing our party as a U.S. Senate candidate who has all of these things in his past. And it is really unfortunate. I saw a reporter, former Minnesotan and good liberal reporter, tweet about looking in his past just for how many times he used the word CUNT. Last year, we're not talking when he was in college. We're not talking 20 years ago. In 2023, he used that word on Twitter 8 times. That is still out.
I'm,
8 times.
I lost you on the audio. What word?
CUNT. I'm not going to say the word. It's not
Are
a
you
word I
saying
like
that?
to have
I'm sorry. He said the C word 8 times? That's what
8
you're
times
saying?
on Twitter in
Oh,
2023. In 2023. Mind-boggling. I'm going to read one of these. Now, I'm not going to read the word, but this is from April 24th, 2023. Must have been, I'm guessing there was a presidential debate. Mike Pence, cuck, paid for. Nikki Haley, CUNT, paid for. Chris Christie, fat as F. He used the F swear word here. Incompetent. Ron DeSantis, did he really look down the road to see how everyone else was going to answer? It's horrifying. The GOP candidates are intentionally horrible. Vivek, I'm watching. This is somebody who literally 7-8 months ago was using these words to talk about some of the best Republican leaders. Again, do we agree with all of these candidates that were running for president? No. But this is somebody who is now going to be the top of the ticket, obviously not presidential, but the top of the Republican Party of Minnesota. It is just really, really alarming and so unfortunate. And so, again, it goes back to our Harrison Bucker conversation, is that now people look to this as thinking this is okay. This is somebody now who has a platform, and people are going to look at this and say, he says it, so I can say it. This kind of way of speaking is embarrassing for a frat guy or somebody, anybody in general. But this is somebody who is now the Republican Party of Minnesota endorsed candidate for US Senate, and I'm ashamed.
Yes, and one of the things I would say is, and this will be the classic game now, is that if we disapprove of the way that he's speaking, it's because we're trying to hide his message, or that he somehow knows this better than we do. It's this absolute classic gaslighting. Royce White does not live in the same world that I live in, and does not live, I would fair to say, in the same world that you and I both live in, and where the vast majority of Minnesotans live. He lives in a different world. And he lives in a world where using that type of foul language, attacking everyone that you can in that type of volatile and disgusting way, attacking every conceivable group that he can, uh, running around with Steve Bannon and Alex Jones, who's just a terrible human being, somehow is going to put him in a path to win. And that's what I'm so damn frustrated with. I'm frustrated with people, and I'm not going to name some of them right now, but I think some of the people that were at that convention that stood on stage with him and placed his name in nomination, who helped speed up the process for him to get endorsed, should be embarrassed of themselves. This is an embarrassment to Republicans, to the Republican brand. Let me also say something to you. I worked against Senator Klobuchar in 2006. I worked on Mark Kennedy's race. Senator Klobuchar is an incredibly good brand in terms of politics in Minnesota. Do I think that there should be a competitive race against her? Of course I do. But I'm going to tell you something. Amy Klobuchar is going to get a hell of a lot of Republicans to publicly come out and support her if Royce White is the candidate. She's already had a very strong support from the business community in this race. To think that Republicans are just going to just wing it and throw Royce White into the race and up against Senator Klobuchar, this is appalling. And again, this is the question that I always say, and I've always asked. I've been hard on whether I've been critical of the idea that Trump is going to be helpful to Republicans winning in Minnesota. I now have come to the position that, if the Donald Trump and the kind of campaign operation that showed up on Friday to this state and that kind of cooperation with the party, that's really going to be helpful, I think, to the overall Republican ticket. And although I do not like Donald Trump and I will not be voting for him, this is an opportunity of where he came to the state and Republicans, from a financial standpoint, had helped fill up the coffers. That's all undone now with Royce White. Royce White is an absolute train wreck. And here's the game that's going to be played here. And this is what we have to be mindful of, Becky, is that we're going to be accused of being racist. We're going to be accused of being part of the establishment and shills, like we're going to talk about in a second, and other those types of comments. Our sense of reality is going to be challenged. Now, I'm not going to be gaslit by Royce White and his supporters. I live in the real world. And I'm going to just tell you, there is no electoral path for Royce White and the ilk that he has stood for and represented. And I hope he gets his ass kicked electorally in the state of Minnesota. It is anyone again who played any role in him getting endorsed should absolutely be embarrassed. And I hope electorally he gets his ass kicked. I also hope that there is a Republican challenge in the primary. I don't know if that's going to happen. I have my doubts, because here's the problem now is that you got a U.S. Senator by the name of Amy Klobuchar, who's going to win re-election, who's got incredible brand in this state, who's in a very strong position. And she's going to win handily. So if you get a Republican that decides to run, first of all, they got to deal with Royce White in the primary. Now, why would anyone now jump in the primary race and run against that jackass? That's what we're going to be dealing with now. You're going to have that goofball as the candidate. And so if that Republican candidate wins in the primary, who are they going to be left? Now their reward for taking one for the team and being helpful is they now got to face Amy Klobuchar. And that's the type of, my hope is that there is someone that understands the role and the requirement to just help the team out and be a responsible steward. I think that elections are great opportunities for good ideas. I think a spirited U.S. Senate race would be great. It would be good for the state. It'd be a good policy discussion, back and forth. I'm not concerned about that type of rhetoric. But do you think that Royce White is going to elevate the race? Do you think that Royce White and the manner in which he's conducting himself is going to be better to Minnesota? That Minnesotans going to be better off? This election cycle is going to be a train wreck. Explain to me, Becky, in as simple as terms as you can. Dumb it down for me as dumb as everybody thinks I am. Explain to me how Royce White helps Republicans in this state.
I'm at a loss there too. It's one of those things I think we've made it very clear that we have certain issues with certain parts of the party or different MAGA lane and President Trump and different things. This has nothing to do with if we have a further right candidate, more power to you. That's fine. It's all the other stuff for me that really is really disturbing about this candidate and how he has embraced kind of these conspiracy theorists and or theories, and he's really putting that out there and being that brand. And like you said, every Republican now in Minnesota that's on the ballot in November is going to be tied to that, right? The Democrats are going to be capitalizing on this at every given moment. And it also ties our hands, right? So now we just had this influx of dollars. Something that's always a really great thing to do before elections is send out sample ballots and have those names in front of folks who are the voters we need to show up, the voters we need to win over. And now how do you do that? You can't. So the party, their hands are tied. You can't just now, you either then put Royce White on there or you don't do them. And so other candidates are really going to be losing out from some of these different resources, whether it's being tied to Royce White or not having the benefits of different mailers and different things that you need to do of having two or more candidates and all of these different regulations in the political world. And so now that we finally have the opportunity to spend resources and to support our candidates, the state party, I feel like, is unfortunately going to have their hands tied a little bit of what they're going to want to do or be able to do because of this affiliation.
I think the party is in a tough position because the party has an obligation to support the endorsement process.
Mhm.
My hope would be that common sense would prevail and that the party would do little or nothing to support Royce White. I think that needs to happen because this is an introduction of chaos, and Royce White has aligned himself with some of the ugliest forces in on the conservative side. It's the Action for Liberties, it's the Steve Bannon, it is Alex Jones. I got to just tell you something. I don't think that element is what has been missing from Republicans winning statewide. I don't believe we need more Action for Liberty, Alex Jones and Steve Bannon, and that's been the missing ingredient. Anyone who thinks that Royce White is a viable candidate for the United States Senate or thinks his brand is going to help the Republican Party win statewide has lost their mind. And what I'm seeing out in social media since this happened, since Royce White's candidacy and stuff, it's just bringing out ugliness. I have Taylor Rahm's father-in-law attacking me on social media for not supporting Royce White, calling me a shill of the DC establishment. The level of mainstreaming and ugliness that we have, I don't have to put up with that. First of all, I'm not a candidate for the United States Senate. I'm certainly not a candidate for Congress in the 2nd Congressional District. And this type of behavior is just wrong. It's a setback for the party. I had a lot of high hopes. I think our interview with Kip and John and the one you and I, when we all participated in the discussion, I was left with a sense of things might get a little better for Republicans here in this state. And that event with Trump was successful by all accounts. I think the endorsement of Royce White fundamentally changes that, and we'll see where we go. But right now, I think he absolutely should be ignored, and he should get no platforming. No one should mainstream his candidacy because I think he is living in a world that is not reality.
My last comment is Royce White was also rather famous for his fear of flying. And I don't know if it was what level of conversation has been had, but to get to work every week, senators take planes. It is a very lengthy car ride to and from DC. And I'm not bashing a fear of flying. Everybody has fears. And if that's his, that's fine. But how, if he were to be successful, would he actually be able to represent the state of Minnesota and all of the millions of folks who live here? Because he can't, if he hasn't overcome that. It's truly, that was mind boggling when I was reading up on this over the weekend. And thankfully, we'll never know because, again, Amy Klobuchar is relatively untouchable in my eyes, and especially in this situation. But just a little nugget I wanted to share.
That's right. Becky, thanks for doing this week, and we'll be following this. We should also note that the filing period is open. If you're a candidate running for office, filing period is open. I want to throw out a shout to the Secretary Steve Simon. Visit his website if you want to file, run for office. We hope everyone runs for office. You're a Democrat, you're a Republican, whatever, just run, participate. It's good for democracy.
Absolutely. Thank you for sharing that. And sorry you're enduring this all on social media. Keep that thick skin, and we'll be here to support you.
Thanks so much. We'll be back next week.
Bye.
We want to thank you for listening to this bonus episode of The Breakdown with Brodkorb and Becky. Before we go, show some love for your favorite podcast by leaving us a review on Apple Podcasts or on the platform where you listen. You can also leave a review on our website at bbreakpod.com. The Breakdown with Brodkorb and Becky will return this week with a new episode. Thank you again for joining us.